All right, back to talking about the federal budget and politics, but this time focusing on the impacts on the property market as new research from Domain challenges long held beliefs about how federal elections shape Australia's property market. Analysing data from the past 7 federal elections, the research uncovers surprising truths about buyer behaviour, auction timing, and party influence on property prices. Joining us to discuss is Domain's Chief of Research, Dr Nicola Powell. Dr Nicola, welcome to the Savings Tip Jar.
Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, it's been just over a year since you were last on. I think the episode was in the 40s from December 2023, and just a bit's going on since then. So we thought we'd get you back on to talk about this interesting topic. But before we do you have a savings tip for us?
I am greedy and I'm going to have two, one property related.
We love it.
Don't have short vision when it comes to the property market. You really need to focus on buying when it's right for yourself, but you've got to play that long game. So don't view property as a short vision. Have that longer term game plan in place. And my second one is to do with food. I think everybody stresses out when it comes to the weekly food shop. It's an extraordinary expense. Meal plan is the best way to save money and stick to that meal plan. And also do not go food shopping when you're hungry because it's detrimental to the food bill.
I counted 3 savings tips there, Nicholas. That's got to be a record from one of our guests on the pod.
Very handy.
Thank you very much for that. Top of the leaderboard for you. Now, getting into the meaty stuff, the budget obviously came out last night. We understand you're based down in Canberra. So were you in there locked up with the budget papers, analysing it all?
Look, I wasn't in the lockup, but it certainly is a buzz in Canberra when it is that federal budget week. It is exciting place to be, and yeah, it is nice to kind of unpick all of the suggested policies that they're going to and improvements they're going to take. And then I also like the response budget too, which is that tonight? Yeah.
Yes, that is tonight. So what have you seen? Is like for home buyers, is there anything particular that stands out in the budget for them?
There is a few things related to the property market. There is a bit of a help to buy expansion. And some of these decisions I think are really needed and they're smart. And we know that help to buy isn't even in place now. It's meant to open in late 2025. But the two key things that they have changed is increase the income caps. So it's gone from 90,000 up to 100,000 for a single person. And for a couple or a single parent, it has gone from 120 up to 160,000. So what that means is there might be many aspiring first home buyers that could perhaps now be eligible under those increased income caps. But the key change that they have made is an increase in property price caps. This is very, very much needed. We know that prices have seen extraordinary rates of price growth in recent years, and what they're going to align, and I don't think I've seen this done before, they're aligning the caps to house prices rather than dwelling prices. So what that means for a market like Sydney, it's gone from 950,000, which was the original cap, up to 1.3, and Brisbane, which we know has been an extraordinary market, has gone from 700,000 price cap up to $1 million. So I do think this is going to be an enabler for some when the initiative actually comes into market.
I think that's a really good point there that you just made. It's like the devil's always in the detail, and to see, little old Brisbane, I'm from there originally. Dom lives in the area, have a, price cap of $1 million. I wouldn't have thought that when the scheme was first launched and when all these home guarantee schemes first came about a few years ago. Now, you briefly mentioned there that the so-called shadow budget is going to be held tonight. It could see an unveiling of some key housing policies by the coalition. I think one of them, we had Angus Taylor on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he talked about the Super for Housing scheme. Just broadly, what do you make of the kind of differences between what, Labor announced last night versus what the coalition could announce tonight?
So, I mean, there are some key differences. And I think when you do that comparison between the coalition and Labor, I mean, Labor are really focused on boosting supply. They're all about support for first home buyers and increasing social and affordable housing. And that's come out of things like the Housing Accord, that 1.2 million homes built over the next 5 years is that really North Star, and then help to buy. Coalition, they are much more focused on market-led solutions. They're also focused on home ownership as well. So I think what we have seen is examples of land release. It's all about freeing up land supply and reducing red tape. But the key difference here for first home buyers is the super saver. So allowing first home buyers to dip into their super of up to $50,000 to contribute to a deposit for their first home. And look, it's hard. We know that we need incentives or initiatives to help, not incentives, initiatives to help first home buyers get onto the property ladder. But it is a concern when we're allowing people to dip into their super. I think I understand that there are caveats that it does need to be paid back into the super, but you've got to remember that you're going to be missing the beauty of compounding interest over time. So I think the judgment really needs to be weighed up on whether it is about buying your first home and dipping into your super or not, because there's fors and against for both.
Now, federal elections are always dominated by debates and discussions about cost of living, and naturally, the cost of housing is a big part of that, and so is the sort of the health of the market as a whole. Now, you guys have obviously done some research into that. What has it found basically? What are the key findings?
So we did a piece of research that looked at myth busting the impact of a federal election on the housing market. And, there are some common misperceptions of it. And that is that a federal election impacts property transactions. And actually, a federal election has no direct impact. And we looked at the past 7 that have no direct impact on transactional activities, people's decisions to buy and sell. The key difference is what does have an impact is political uncertainty. Now, political uncertainty can happen at any given moment. It's a monthly index that is created by scanning media and scanning the positive and negative sentiment coming out of media around political policy. I would say we have seen a bit of an increase in the political uncertainty index, which means that it will weigh down the number of transactions. But that is not necessarily to do with the federal election. It's to do with political uncertainty. And we also looked at other things. So we looked at, we know the psychology of sellers is I am not going to schedule my home for auction on an election weekend, but there is a small pool of people that actually do. And so what we see is people do on bulk avoid that election weekend, but we see a spike either pre or post that election weekend. But for any seller out there that is gameful to put their home under the hammer on a federal election weekend, they do tend to get actually a better result. So it does pay dividends.
That's really interesting, Nicola, because I couldn't imagine darting around the city, finding a place to vote on election day and then, putting my hand up for $1 million at auction. It sounds quite stressful, and you've only had a sausage sizzle all day to eat. But it's kind of interesting this time around because we've seen the potential election timeline pushed back due to Cyclone Alfred. It was probably going to be held in April. And as we know, an auction marketing period is 4 weeks. Is this going to give enough lead time for people to change their mind about putting their property to auction if the sort of election cycle is less than 4 weeks?
Yeah, so what you tend to see is people reschedule on an auction. So, they may have decided, right, I'm going to sell, but once the election is announced and the date is firm, you then see people either they withdraw their home from auction and they go, right, I'm going to sell slightly later, or they just shift the day of the auction, which is why you get this particular cluster occur after a federal election. But I do wonder though, you're saying a lot, I love that analogy, of trying to bid $1 million, dashing around voting, bid $1 million and have a sausage sizzle. It's a lot to do. But I do also think that many of us are pre-voting too, postal voting. Which I think, if you're a serious buyer, and I think this is what occurs on a federal election weekend, if you were a serious buyer, you would have pre-voted. You would have already made sure that you had ticked that box, and so that your pure focus could be on that home that is going up for auction that you've got your eye on.
Now, Nicola, just generally on the property market as a whole at the moment, are you starting to see a bit of a pickup in activity? Because obviously we had a long period of subdued listings. You mentioned how maybe people are reluctant to put their house up for sale or for auction until after the federal budget. But do you think just generally, broadly, we're starting to see a bit of a pickup in activity, maybe perhaps on the back of the recent RBA rate cut?
Absolutely. Sentiment is a really big thing that impacts the housing market. And when you look at consumer sentiment, it has jumped. It's now at a 3-year high. It's still negative, and that pretty much has been the nature of the Australian sentiment for the last few years. But what we have seen is a vast improvement in sentiment. And the reason I bring this up is sentiment is a really big driver of people's decisions to buy and sell property. So generally, when you do see an increase in sentiment, you tend to see that historically plays out well for the housing market, and you do see high levels of housing turnover. But there are early signs that even buyers are reacting to the rate cut. I think there was an element that we have waited so long for this rate cut to be delivered. I think some were already reacting that we're almost there. So we've started to see an increase in buyer inquiry. That was happening at the very beginning of the year. So it was happening in January, which means there were more buyer inquiries occurring across all of our capital cities in January compared to the January prior. And that also occurred in February. So I do think that it's the certainty that has changed that outlook for buyers. I think buyers are still mindful of how much they pay for a home. I think affordability is very much under the spotlight still. There is a wide gap between where home prices are and the capacity of buyers to pay for that home. But I think that sentiment has changed, and those early signals show that buyers are reacting to it. It's coming out in higher levels of inquiry. And historically, you always tend to find that buyers react first, and then sellers react to the more positive nature coming from buyers.
For sure. And just finally, Nicola, we'll tie it back to the research. So one of the myths that you talked about is that, the party in power has a good influence over property prices and home ownership rates, but there's actually no real link between house price performance and home ownership rate and the party in power of the day. Could this kind of infer that, previous governments haven't really done enough to address home ownership rates, or is this a suggestion that, the housing market is bigger than the government of the day?
Very pointy and good question. I think that what it showcases is there was very little difference between the performance of house prices and Liberal and Labor governments. There was a slightly higher proportion of first home buyers under a Labor government compared to Liberal, but very little actually separating the two. And I think what it really does showcase is there are many things that influence our property price cycles, and it's not just the policies coming from government.
Well, as they always say, the house always wins. We always love talking property on the Savings Tip Jar podcast. So great to have your company, Nicola Powell. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good stuff.